Thank you, Aaron, and thanks again to Tim. Really fascinating stuff. And I think it's a really appropriate jumping off point to our next conversation, because just as Tim is asking us to burn the box on the thought of transportation, to truly get some of the benefits that we have to really think outside of the box, recycle that box for sustainable energy. And I am so grateful to be joined by a fantastic panel up here. We have Carolyn Shellman from CPS Energy. She is the Chief Legal Officer and General Counsel for CPS. Edward Yim, Energy Policy Advisor for the District of Columbia's Department of Energy. So thank you for coming in from Washington, D.C. Christine Cole, the Global Technical Marketing at Itron. And Jan Vrins, new role, new title, same job every day though. Jan is the Managing Director and Global Energy Segment Leader at Guidehouse. And I'd like Jan we're going to do a longer introduction, talk about some priorities that each of our participants see as long-term priorities for sustainable energy. So Jan, why don't you share Guidehouse's vision of what the sustainable energy future looks like?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. It's great to be back here. It's always good to be here. Excited talking about this topic. And just for people in the room, as Chris alluded, Guidehouse now is nothing else than the combination of PwC's ex-public services consulting business with Navigant. So yes, I still lead the energy, sustainability and infrastructure practice. 700 people worldwide working with governments, utilities, energy companies, as well as large corporations in this space. This slide, and there's a lot on this slide, and I'm sure this will be made available, but this really talks about the interplay between the city and the utility. And I do recognize there are other stakeholders engaged as well, but I think this interplay between a city and utilities is really key. On the left side, yes, these are the drivers, and we all know what the drivers are in terms of more renewable energy, grid improvements. Resiliency is a key topic, also here in San Antonio, but also in other places. We will have more and more intense major events coming at us in the next couple of years. On average, in the last 30 years, we had 5 major hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, over $1 billion of damage in the US. In the last 5 years, that average of 5 has gone up to 13. We don't see that slowing down anytime soon. So making our energy infrastructure and our energy system more resilient is definitely top of mind for a lot of governments as well as utilities and energy companies. In the middle, and this is just an example because I think this is the key, the dialogue that has to take place between the city and the utility is what we call the smart city platform. And there's things in there as distribution and resources, transportation, city services, buildings, and the energy grid itself. And around that, and I'm not going to go through this, but around that there are several areas where the city and the utility should collaborate. And again, this is just a random example of another project that we did where in certain cases the utility takes the lead because it's closer to the utilities' assets that they have, infrastructure that they run, and operations that they run. And in other cases, the city takes the lead on that. But it's always a collaboration. So, when you talk about autonomous vehicles, and we've done a lot of work around autonomous vehicles, yes, it increases not only safety, it reduces travel time, and it reduces CO2 emissions. I think LA has done a really good job of looking at this area. The next iteration is AVs, integrated with traffic management systems, so that actually those AVs knows what's going on from a traffic perspective as well, and automatically get rerouted and stuff like that. So this is just an example. For people that are interested, there's a link to a white paper here, and if you want to send me a note or ping me on Twitter or LinkedIn, and I will send it to you. What this does really is it not only supports the overarching goals of addressing climate change, supporting citizens' well-being, as well as driving economic development. We are a firm believer that all this actually creates more jobs, and we have seen very strong business cases how that actually does it. But it also opens up new roles for the utilities, both on the electric side as well as on the water, waste, and gas side for that matter. So this is, I think, an exciting space, Chris. It's really about that dialogue. And I'll talk a little bit later when you ask some of the questions about how you do it, but this is kind of a lay of the land of how we look at, this whole smart city of the future play between, the utility, energy company, and then the city.
Well, thank you, Jan. And I think that that's a wonderful way to start this conversation. I'd like now to turn to Carolyn to talk a little bit about CPS, and if we could bring the CPS's slide up, because as Jan's talking about what both the utility, the city, you live this every day. So can you talk to us a little bit more about the CPS story?
Sure. CPS Energy is really in the sweet spot in terms of addressing all these problems because we are owned by a city and we serve 31 other cities. I want to give a shout out to one of our board members, Janie Gonzalez, I believe is still here. I can't see her. Good. And we also have one of our mayors, Mayor Gutierrez from Schertz, I believe. Are you over there still? And so when I say we're in the sweet spot, the things that we want to do, if we want to coordinate with the city of San Antonio as our owner and partner is a huge incentive for us to do exciting things. And we have these wonderful 31 other cities, some very small and some bigger like Schertz, that are also doing exciting things. So some of the things that we're working on are shown on this slide, and that I just wanted to kind of highlight a few of them. We are going to be rolling out an EV managed charging pilot. We don't have a lot of EVs here in the San Antonio area yet, but we want to be ready for them and we want to encourage them. We have had for a long time a STEP program, which is Save for Tomorrow energy program, and it provides energy efficiency, demand response, all kinds of products and services for all of our customers in order to reduce energy consumption and reduce demand. The big thing that we've been talking about, and if you've been here yesterday and today, you've already heard us mention it, but we have a new project that we're just about ready to roll out in coordination with the city of San Antonio involving a pilot of smart streetlights and control systems. And Itron's involved in this, so maybe I will leave it to Christine to talk a little bit about. But for us, it's going to give us, in this pilot with 3 partners, Itron, AT&T, and Insight, will give us the ability to monitor the thousands of streetlights that we operate within the city, give us the ability to know when they're out so that we can replace them quickly for safety and other important reasons, and also perhaps the opportunity to do some dimming, because we've got people in parts of our cities who want really dark lights, and we've got people who want them really bright for safety. So the other thing I would point out here is that we are involved real quickly in a project with Enchanted Rock to provide resiliency services, and we're real excited we're doing that with HEB. So hopefully in the course of these 2 days you'll hear about a lot of these other programs.
Carolyn, thank you so much. And I'd like to now turn to Edward. Your perspective on long-term sustainability and some of the priorities that the Washington, D.C. and the Department of Energy and Energy Policy has.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Good morning. I have a fun joke. So why are the hippopotamuses in Egypt not all that concerned about the impact of climate change on their habitat? Because they live in denial. I said it was a fun joke, not a good joke.
I recruited him both for his humor and his expertise. So he's got a tight 15 set this afternoon.
Yeah, in Washington, D.C., we have a carbon neutrality goal by 2050 with an interim goal to cut carbon by 50% by 2032. And to help us do that, we passed a law for the building sector. We passed a law to establish an energy budget per square foot for all existing buildings larger than 10,000 square feet, which will cover about 75% of the city's total square footage. And we will issue this year a net zero ready building code which will, from that, we expect to cut our building energy demand for new buildings by about 60 to 70% compared to existing buildings' performance. On the energy side, we have 100% RPS to be achieved by 2032. On the transportation side, we will try to limit the use of passenger vehicles to comprise no more than 25% of all city trips. And we have a law mandating that all fleets be zero-emission vehicles by 2040. And lastly, we will maximize the use of DER so that our city can turn into an aggregation of net zero energy neighborhoods that can function as virtual power plants. And we're doing all of this stuff because we clearly grasp the urgency of the climate crisis that we have. And what we have is an emissions trend that is heading toward a warming level of at least 4 degrees. And that's the level that's been described as catastrophic by international agencies and our best climate researchers. So clearly we have to create a new trend, and that's what our effort is about.
Thank you, Edward. I'd love to now turn to Christine, and thank you for being a trooper. I know you've been traveling a lot recently, but Itron, synonymous with large utility infrastructure and network communications, but you have a really fascinating push towards long-term sustainability. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm Christine Cole. I'm with the Smart City Group inside the Networks Business Unit at Itron. And the reason why there's a vision slide up is because we're blessed with a new CEO who absolutely believes in saving this planet and doing it in a way that makes sense for the people and to do it economically and actually as fast as possible. I feel like I could almost put up your guidepost slide again because what you had on that slide is exactly what Itron enables. We believe in being the enabler for bringing all this new stuff into cities, utilities around the planet. One of the things that's really interesting with us and talking about the smart city with CPS, we started with CPS actually doing metering for electricity and gas, and we evolved into the smart city side of it, and we're doing the streetlights, which is going to enable you to go, if you so choose, into the full smart city portfolio. We have, I think, 125 partners now that allow you to bring in all kinds of different devices and sensors to really push things forward. My specific area of expertise, my strategic responsibility is for electric vehicles, and I also support some of the work in the renewables and energy storage area. And these are very, very close to my heart because the reason I know how lucky we are to have our new CEO is because before he was our CEO, I had a conversation with him where I said, I am the Lorax, and he said, I am the Lorax too. And he really, truly takes it to heart. And what we say about our vision is 100% true. We want to do everything we can to make this a better place for everyone. And the way we do that is by enabling cities and utilities.
What a great jumping off point for the next topic of conversation. And that is that both cities and utilities have a mission of providing clean, or have the mission of providing safe, reliable, and inexpensive power. I mean, that's the foundational agreement that we've had for 100 years. How do we now, and I'm going to turn initially to you, Carolyn, how do we add sustainable, environmentally clean power to that without sacrificing the safety, the reliability, and that inexpensive nature?
Thinking about this, the first thing that I thought about was to consider what's happening in Australia. Without going into all the details, you know it, I think what we're seeing there is a compromise of safety and reliability that is caused by climate change. So the short answer is I'm not sure that you can have sustainability without some additional cost. And I actually think that if you don't spend it now, it's going to be more costly in the future. What CPS Energy is doing is relying on what we're calling our flexible path because we want to provide a sustainable future for our customers, and we want to do it in a prudent, planned way. And so we are keeping our options open in terms of our future investments. We are continuing to invest in renewables. We will explore and utilize energy storage. And when energy storage gets to be cost effective, which we think is what is necessary to fully implement and integrate renewables, we will be ready for it. And I think we will get there, but I don't believe that you can expect that everything is going to happen without real attention to both reliability, resilience, and trying to keep the cost affordable.
I really appreciate that, and this echoes a lot of the things that Paula was speaking about yesterday. It would be really irresponsible in a city like San Antonio to not factor in the needs of all people to make sure that they can still have electricity so that they can stay cool in the summer and warm in the winter and their lights come on, to just immediately shift over to this 100% decarbonized. So it's a pathway. Jan, I want to turn to you on this. Carolyn mentioned Australia. You have a wonderful, you sit at sort of examining the global perspective. What are your thoughts on how we can balance these 4 mission critical needs?
Yeah, I think 5 years ago, when I spoke to utility CEOs, I told them that their world will be different and their world will be a lot tougher to manage. I think it's here right now. I think it's not about safe, reliable, and affordable anymore. I think it's about smart, and I think it's about resilient, and I think it's about sustainable at the same time. So from 3 elements in terms of managing, a utility operations and the infrastructure around it, you go to 6. But it's an exponential complexity that utilities have to deal with. Thank God there are technologies that will help, but they're not all mature yet, and they're in certain cases they're too expensive. So yes, it's gonna take 15 years. The global perspective is that Europe is moving really, really fast at a really fast pace. We see a lot in the U.S. at the local level, like here in San Antonio, but also in other communities and states. DC, perfect example. The last thing I will say is this change will come faster and faster. And if you think that certain solutions are not viable today, they can be viable in 18 months from now. And if you think certain assets will stay there for 30 years, that might not be 30 years. So that's all I can say, because I think it's just going to continue to accelerate. We're tracking all these tipping points. I spoke to the folks at Hawaii Electric in Hawaii, and I think this is a very telling story, and some of you might know this, but they are buying today utility-scale solar plus storage for Hawaii. So it's not huge. So for the island, at the same price point as what they bought just solar for 2 years ago. So 2 years later, they can, for the same price, they buy solar plus storage. And that's how fast these things go.
I mean, that's a huge game changer and something we're looking at too at Zpryme. You mentioned both, you mentioned some of the technical challenges to it, and I want to bring Christine into this question right here. How will network communications, how will a smart cities approach, a connected communities approach, help to address this challenge of sustainability and affordability and reliability?
Well, that's a really good question. And one of the things that Itron is doing is not depending on any one particular type of communication. So we have a communications agnostic approach. We have our standard RF mesh, which allows for interesting use cases to occur because it allows us to do a lot of edge computing and peer-to-peer communications, which is very helpful when you need to do things very quickly. But it also allows you to put numerous different sensors into a specific area. And the way an RF mesh actually works is the more sensors, the more devices you have on the network, the stronger and more resilient the network becomes. So the exact opposite of what you would see in other communication strategies. But it only works for fixed devices. So when we're working out our communication strategy, there'll be some mobile devices that cities will need. And so we're going to be working with other communications, cellular, for example, and other things that make sense for that particular use case, that particular device, that particular need. So the thing about the technology is it's moving, it's changing, it's adapting very, very quickly. And Itron is doing everything in its power to adapt with these needs. We look at everything from a use case perspective, and we're not stuck on any particular technology. We're happy to work with our partners, with our customers, with communities to figure out the best way to solve the problem.
Thank you. Edward, I want to turn to you, bring you into this conversation right now, and start to evolve it. What role does policy and regulation play in the clean energy transition? And then still speaking to that idea of maintaining reliability and affordability as we move to green energy.
Maybe I'll start at a little bit high level, but I absolutely agree that the policy and regulation are essential tool for the clean energy transition. I mean, market-based solutions are good, we need them, but clearly they are not sufficient. And I'll give a quick example that indicates the status of market-based solutions today. I was sitting in at a roundtable discussion of corporate sustainability officers, and they were all discussing the best way to get their CEOs and CFOs to sign off on sustainability measures. And their number one answer was peer pressure, meaning that our rival companies are doing them and they're making a big deal out of them. So the good news is peer pressure works. The bad news is that the fate of humanity shouldn't have to depend on the high school politics of CEOs. But our advocates aren't all that much better either. Yeah. Like when we talk to our college campus sustainability officers and I tell them, what can we do to help you guys do those things that will cut costs and emissions? And they tell us really that you got to make us do it. Our board of trustees will not move until we have to do it. So to be clear, no one is opposing clean energy or fighting climate change, quite to the contrary. But what they tell us is that we want to, but we can't. So if you listen to that, that's a lot like the behavior caused by addiction. Like I want to quit, but I can't. The New England Journal of Medicine 5 years ago came up with a really good study about quitting smoking. So they piloted various incentive programs for quitting smoking. One of the test groups was promised $800 if the participants stayed off cigarettes for 6 months. Another group had the participants depositing $150 of their own money, and if they stayed off cigarettes for 6 months, they would get the deposit back, and then get a bonus of $650. Does that sound like performance-based rate making to anyone? It is. So the result was that the success rate for the pure reward one was 17% of the participants quit smoking. The result for the second group was more than 50% quit smoking. So translating that to our world, the problem here is that in most cases, people will not volunteer to ante up their own money first. So that's where policy and regulation comes in, so that we can require, figuratively speaking, ante up, which will economically benefit them, so that we can turn that behavior change effectiveness from 17% to greater than 50%.
Hey Chris, a quick comment on what Edward mentioned. I think we're at the tipping point now where hopefully, Edward, peer pressure is still there because it's always good. But we see more and more, and we work for McDonald's on their global sustainability and energy strategy. We work for General Motors, we work for IKEA, we work for large port operators. We do see we're at the tipping point right now where they're not only getting pressure from their peers within their sector, because we see that a lot like in the steel and in the mining industries, but actually their shareholders and their investors. I think pressure increases significantly there because to be honest, they believe that carbon-based assets long-term are actually a liability to them, and more from customers as well. And yes, I do think that U.S. is probably not leading the way here, but these are global corporations, so they look at their global footprint and driving that forward. So I think we're really at that tipping point now where it's good that there's peer pressure, but I think there's pressure coming from above in terms of the investors and the shareholders, as well as from their customers, I think.
Yeah, no, I certainly don't want to downplay any of the movement that's been made. I mean, even yesterday I saw that letter from BlackRock CEO, certainly JP Morgan report, all those movements are all welcome. In Washington, D.C., we're trying to cut our energy demand in the building sector by about 50% in the next 20 years. That level of reduction is absolutely necessary for us to decarbonize affordably, but will probably be nearly impossible relying on voluntary measures alone.
Carolyn, great points, both of you. I want to bring Carolyn in on this from the CPS perspective, from the state of Texas's perspective. You're not out there, San Antonio is, but the state of Texas wide is not necessarily out there like Washington, D.C. or California. But from your perspective, what does regulation and policy have to play? What role does regulation and policy have to play in this
Well, I don't
discussion?
agree with you about Texas. I'm a regulatory and policy person, so I understand that good regulation can work, but I am a big fan of the Texas model, and we haven't solved everything here in terms of incentives for new generation, but I think that the success we've had with renewables and innovation and bringing lots of new transmission investment to Texas have all been market-driven and customer-driven. Very little of that has been mandated. So I think that we're an unusual market because we're small in one state, but without a lot of mandates, we have become a leader in renewables, and I think you will see that continue to happen because, as Jan says, it's coming not from the regulators, it's coming from customers, it's coming from cities who are willing to invest like CPS Energy is, but we're not alone.
That's a great point, and certainly Texas has been a leader in wind power and moving very quickly into solar and storage as well. So that is to be applauded. And that's the first time I've ever heard Texas referred to as small, because even though the ERCOT market does stand alone, is contained, you guys you're big. You're big. Christine, what are your thoughts on regulation and policy and their impact?
So I totally agree with what you just said. I think it's a people's movement. I think everyone's starting to get it that we can't wait for the government to make the decisions or regulations to change. We need to push it from the people's side. And I think we're seeing it everywhere. I've just come back from Europe. That explains my voice. And it's amazing how fast things are changing in Europe. It's amazing how fast things are changing here too. People's attitudes are changing. They're not just worried about the finances, although it's really helpful that everything price-wise is coming down and it's making it easy to justify a change to renewables and storage. I think it also helps in the equity. I was talking in San Diego with some of the clean tech folks about the promise zone, some areas in San Diego that are a little bit distressed. And bringing solar and renewables and other renewables and storage and EV charging stations into those areas changes everything. It brings those areas up very, very rapidly and makes them where they can compete. And so I think what we're seeing is a real change now in just how we think. I think people are getting it. Climate change is real. It is happening. And it's time for us to do something to combat it, to get things back under control.
Before we move on from regulation, Jan, you have a wonderful global perspective on this, and you're seeing this. Are there any regulations or policy? I think there's broad agreement on stage that it is market pressure, that it is customer pressure, that is most propelling this change. But is there anything that you've seen out there that from a regulatory perspective that really excites you to incentivize further market change?
Yeah, I think we need policies, as Edward said. I think regulation is trying to play catch up to, I think, the market demands. That's my view on it. And I think every country and every state is struggling with that. Performance-based, absolutely, 100% we need to go there. I think there's great examples in the UK, and they're going through another renewal of their Rio regulatory framework. I think there's some really interesting regulatory work done in Hawaii, for example, New York. California, I'm not a big fan of California because it's very fragmented. They're taking one technology at the same time and they're not looking at the whole system. You have to look at the entire system. New York, for example, guess what? You can't survive cold winter weeks in New York without some sort of a renewable gas if you think about a zero carbon system. So you're not going to get there with renewables and battery storage only. So right now we need the other resources still to get through the cold winter weeks. So now you need to create policies where you take offshore wind and you create hydrogen as a renewable fuel to heat the houses in the winter. So that's some really interesting thinking there that's going on in New York, because I think the role of gas is really critical. And even here, you can't switch from one day to the other. So you need to have a pathway to where you increase, renewable fuels and decrease carbon fuels over time. You can't turn on switches and off switches. That's just not how it works. But there are pathways to renewable gas, which will help tremendously in a lot of places in the world.
Thank you, Jan. I'd like to turn the conversation now to transmission. Carolyn, you touched on that. What role does transmission play in the expansion of clean and sustainable energy?
I think it's a huge factor. I can speak generally about Texas because we've done a lot of work building new transmission lines that were mandated by or incented by the legislature. But back ending in 2013, we had installed, as part of our CREZ process, competitive renewable energy zones, 18,000 new transmission miles. And it was at a cost of $7 billion, which was almost twice what they projected it was going to be, but it has been huge in terms of bringing all the wind resources that we have in West Texas to the population centers in Central Texas and in East Texas. So I think it's huge. I kind of follow what FERC is doing with the NOPR that they have to try to develop new transmission incentives, and it's a lot more complicated when you have multi-state jurisdictions like that, but it is huge, and I think it's what we need to do to make sure that we have access to the renewable power that we can generate.
Any thoughts on this, Christine, what the role of transmission might have in terms of providing clean energy? And feel free to talk about the network communications aspect of it, as that will have a strong impact as well.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, we're not in transmission per se, but what we are in is grid optimization, grid orchestration. And this is where our communications, and others as well, but I'll talk about Itron because that's what I know about, where we can talk across large areas and make sure that the orchestration is done so that things move where they need to move. We can, help with the peak shaving, load control, that sort of thing. Excuse me. And I think as we get this communication in place and things get smarter and things get faster, we'll get much better at utilizing that energy that we have available to us through renewables.
Right. From DC's perspective and from your perspective, Edward, the role of transmission in helping with clean energy.
Yeah, just as part of the larger collective unit, we want a strong, healthy transmission that can really bridge all the renewable, that can integrate all the renewables, that can do the system balancing really smartly. So we support all of that. But from the city's perspective, we try to be as energy independent as possible. So what we would normally the model has been that we are just passive consumers of the transmission supply, which is a dominant supply. But we'd like to really flip it going forward, where we are largely driving our own energy generation and consumption, and use the transmission as a backup.
I'll say one thing about that. In Europe, they've flipped it upside down, and they now say the last mile is the first mile.
It's a great way. Jan, I think you want to jump in here.
Yeah, I think we need to do all of the above. What Caroline said, we definitely need more transmission to bring the renewables into places where we need it. We also need cities to be smarter about energy usage. In the end, all that will not be enough. In the end, we will have more renewables during the day than we actually consume throughout the system. And there must be a way to take those renewables, instead of curtailing them and letting them go to waste, using them to produce a renewable fuel. And that's again, this is not a thing that will happen tomorrow, but we see renewable gas, hydrogen is the best candidate at this moment, coming into certain systems, not all, but in certain systems within the next 10 years. And that will help tremendously to get to zero carbon ultimately. So without a renewable gas, we can't get to a zero emissions system, period, because there will not be enough battery storage. So we need transmission, we need grid scale storage, we need do all the thing on the consumer side. It will not be enough. We need a renewable fuel in the system, specifically in places like where it's cold or really warm during long periods of time, that's where we need some sort of renewable gas.
Right, and for like industrial application.
You mentioned curtailment, and that immediately brings to mind the challenges that a sustainable energy future. You also, this idea of gas to hydrogen. So I want to point the question right back at you. What are some of those biggest challenges that we face in the energy transition?
Yeah, I think we spoke about it. Stranded assets, huge problem. What do we do with stranded assets? And not only, to be honest, the power infrastructure and assets, but even oil and gas assets, right? If you think about it, in the North Sea, we're looking at taking drill platforms and making them hubs for renewable farms around it, and serve as a transmission hub or hydrogen production facility, at sea. So those are things that are being looked at right now in Europe. In Europe, there's so much offshore wind right now that we can't build transmission to support all that. We have to find ways to take all that renewable energy at sea and produce hydrogen, put it in pipelines, and bring it onshore to the south of Germany, where you need it for the heavy industries that Edward was referring to. Regulatory, we need a complete overhaul of regulatory frameworks, performance-based, not asset cost-based, which it is right now. And then last but not least, I think the human element of this, so the change itself with all the stakeholders, the utilities, with the cities, with other stakeholders, and the fact that we need new skills and capabilities. I don't think we can underestimate the human impact of this change. So those would be my top three.
No, that's fantastic. I'm glad you brought the human element into it, because that is something that we try to put centrally at the heart of this conference. None of this happens. What is our purpose? It is to help with long-term sustainability, but ultimately to help all people have a healthier, cleaner environment, and an economically viable one at that. Specifically in relation to CPS, I'd like you to take a look at that question, Carolyn. What are the biggest challenges that you're facing towards that long-term energy, clean energy future?
Well, I think generally at a high level, I think climate change is the big issue, and cost-effective energy storage is second. I'm with the other panelists who believe that there is a role for natural gas to play. I think that we are going to rely on it, and I think that we're doing some things with renewable gas on a very small scale, but we're not going to be developing the technology. We're looking for the scientists of the world to do that. I think there will be some new advances in energy storage. We aren't alternatives to lithium-ion batteries. I don't think that is the answer for the storage that we're going to have in the future. But what CPS Energy is doing is trying to get familiar with the technologies that are available, invest in them as they are cost-effective, and start moving both in our planning process and in our investing process toward the future that we are all describing here. And I think we will get there. But it takes support from our customers, support from our communities, and a lot of good planning and a lot of good luck, I think.
Well, but before we move on from the challenges to talk about solutions, Edward, I'd love your perspective on what are some of the biggest challenges that DC is facing from a clean energy transition perspective.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it really still remains energy reduction. The deep decarbonization framework really spells out clearly three things we have to do in a sequential and coordinated way, which is, one is minimize your energy footprint, then you decarbonize your energy supply, and then you fuel switch. Because energy generation and other things look more sexier, I think people just kind of skip the first step, but then you really end up putting the cart before the horse. Because if you don't optimize your energy footprint, then you really over-procure your supply and overbuild your infrastructure. And in 2012, IPCC researchers came up with a very sobering analysis that if we don't cut our energy demand by a third from the baseline, our mitigation measures will not be economically feasible, that we won't be able to afford them. So I think that's really key. And the second one is really doing things early. I think Carolyn mentioned that, we can incur a cost now, but if we delay, the cost will be much greater. So I mean, we know that the mitigation measures act like a compounding interest, that their impact of our mitigation effort has a greater impact the sooner you do it. And the longer you delay it, the greater the burden we're placing upon ourselves, not just incrementally, but exponentially.
I'm going to just apologize to the audience. I've been a selfish moderator. We're getting to the end of this, but I have one more question for the panelists, and so I apologize that I haven't left time for your questions, but I'm sure you'll have a chance to talk with all of them coming up at lunchtime or something like that. But let's talk solutions. And Christine, I want to turn first to you and say and ask, from your perspective, from Itron's perspective, we've painted both the challenges and some of the opportunities in this. What does the future look like for you with a clean energy dynamic system at Itron?
Well, to be honest with you, everything gets smarter, right? Everything gets faster, everything gets smarter, everything's talking to everything else in the new world of machine to machine at nth speed. And we have lots of renewables. Ideally, we see the ability to island microgrids when we need to during emergencies, that we have a vast resource of renewables, vast storage capability, however that may be, and that it is readily available to everyone, not just a few. I think this is a very real future, and I don't think it's way out there in the future either. We're moving so fast now. Everything's moving fast now. You know, I always talk about, my son is in AI. My husband works for Ford. He does their infotainment system, which is autonomous vehicles. I'm with Itron, and our dinner conversations are real interesting, by the way.
I can imagine.
It's pretty crazy because how fast it's all happening. AI, robotics, automation is changing everything very quickly, and that includes how cities work and how utilities provide to those cities. So I see it happening fast, and I'm very positive about it because I'm a Lorax, and I believe we're going to get this right.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. What's the clean energy future for Washington, D.C. and beyond, Edward?
I'll just give one quick example. We're currently helping this developer build affordable housing unit. They'll begin construction next year. It's passive house, so it's net positive energy. They use about 15% of energy that their peer buildings use. It will be intentionally islandable with their rooftop solar and battery storage that's available to the affordable housing units. It just uses one geothermal well to handle all of the heating and cooling for 18 units. I think that's really the future. So that once that's able to interact smartly with the distribution grid, so that it can interact and provide services and function well as part of the overall system, then that would be the goal.
Thank you. Carolyn, the flexible path to me seems to be one of the most innovative way to react to market signals, to react to pressure. Where are we in 20 years in San Antonio? What is that? What is CPS? How are you at the center of a clean energy future at that point?
I think that I said earlier that we're kind of in the sweet spot just because we are owned by the city of San Antonio and have them as a partner. And I think that in 20 years, we are going to be effectively using a lot of these technologies that we're piloting that I talked about earlier to be able to know what's going on in different areas of the city, whether it's noise levels, parking availability, air quality, water if there's flooding. The sensors that we're using in this pilot, I think, will give us a roadmap to how we can make the city effective and better for all the people who live there and live here. And we also are going to be relying on the platform and infrastructure that CPS and other partners here have. So I think it's a great opportunity. I'm real excited about where San Antonio is going to be, and CPS Energy is going to be driving as much as we can with the city to make it work.
Thank you. Jan, I'll give you the final optimistic word here on the future.
So I talk a lot about San Antonio and what CPS is doing when I speak around the world. So hopefully Paul is going to forgive me to call out another example while I'm in San Antonio. But I think what San Antonio is doing on CPS is really great. They have the vision. They are executing. They've achieved a lot around all the things that we've been talking about. And they have pathways, because you need to have pathways. We don't know what the world will look like. Not even 15 years from now, let alone 30 or 40 years from now. So you need to keep your options open. I think they're doing a great job there. But Los Angeles, I'm going to shout out for Los Angeles. Everybody talks about California like, oh, this is California. That's not relevant. It doesn't work that way. Los Angeles, big city, huge amount of buildings, traffic, heavy industries, oil and gas. They have the port. It's a tremendous challenge. But what LA is doing is really impressive. They implemented a advanced traffic management system. They reduced traffic time by 12%, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and increased safety. They're doing smart street lighting. They're doing smart parking systems. They are moving their entire generation towards renewables and storage. And they're looking at now developing a hydrogen production plant, because they know that they need some sort of a renewable fuel. So shout out to LA. I think they're doing great stuff. They have a great plan there as well. So if you look at, hey, a big city that is really making progress and has a strong vision, LA is the place to look at.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists for this fascinating perspective. I think the broad takeaway is that we have challenges, but the opportunity to make a real impact on creating a long-term sustainable energy future is right there for the taking. Thank you all.